Good day. This LecVid focuses on the essay of T.S. Eliot titled Tradition and the Individual Talent, which is one of his works that falls under criticism. Before talking about the contents, let's take a peek at his biographical accounts and his accomplishments as a man of letters. He was an American born writer. He earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Harvard University. He is regarded as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. As a poet, he abandoned the moralizing style and does not adhere with poetry as an inspired overflow of spontaneous emotion, but as a carefully made aesthetic object. Note how he gives prime importance to aesthetics or artistry. His poem, The Wasteland, was considered his best known poem and the most influential poem. It is considered a primary text in literary modernism. It is described as allusive, experimental, and technically daring. Although not about war, it made use of war as its backdrop to bring to mind the dilemma of the modern man's vulnerability of soul because of the barrenness of modern culture. Here, he used fragmentation and discontinuity. No transitional passages or narrative thread, expecting the readers to construct a pattern to see the holistic view of the text. Thus, a seeming absence of linearity. Do you see the congruence between the technique and the contents? When he wanted to talk about the fragmented soul, the style also is in the form of fragmentation. This thought and the idea of treating poetry as an aesthetic object are proofs that his work is a combination of spiritual insight and technical innovation. This carries on the tradition of symbolist poets. Again, we are emphasizing that his effect in the literary circle is not merely formal, but spiritual and philosophical. To emphasize, he is both a poet and a critic. His works are described as both impersonal and objective, incorporating masks, role playing, and multiple voices, but at the same time saturated with displaced personal pain, regret, sexual desire, and emotional and spiritual yearning. As expected for a critic, he wrote literary essays and reviews. He defined the critical standards of an era and recast the literary tradition. He is also remembered for establishing key terms for analysis and evaluation. Naturally, these things that he introduced were followed by other writers. Such is the greatness of his influence that he was regarded as the Pope and a literary dictator. Aside from being a poet and a critic, he also wrote drama. He revived the poetic drama for the contemporary audience. Note that poetic drama falls under the old tradition, but its revival meant his recognition of what was established in the past. However, if the tradition then was the use of rhymed verses, his was unrhymed. This suggests a deviation from an older tradition, making his work possess an identity of novelty. He is regarded as a self made modernist. By the techniques found in the wasteland, modernism is very prominent. One of the names in the modernist tradition, Ezra Pound, said that he, Eliot, trained himself and modernized himself on his own. His greatest accomplishment was when he became a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. Let us now proceed to the text. Again, this is entitled Tradition and the Individual Talent. At this point, let's begin with the two terms. If you remember what is a classic, we started the same way. Between the terms tradition and traditional, which is emotionally charged. You're right if you tell me that it is the latter. It even connotes being old or old fashioned. For what reason? Because the reference of a tradition is the past. Yet, despite suggesting the past, it is considered a convention. A long standing tradition is an ideal in the past that has passed the test of time. The work is in three parts, which I titled The Notion of Literary Tradition for the first part, the poetic practices required by tradition for the second part, and the conclusion for the last part. As per the notion of literary tradition, the writing made a very strong claim at the beginning, citing that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. Indeed, even when we take a look at that situation or that statement in more practical sense in our lives, for example, we would always criticize. This is always manifested in our reactions to what we see, what we read, and what we hear. In the literary aspect, an observation was cited right at the beginning. That is, when we criticize, we normally criticize the artist, not the work. When praise is given, it is accorded to the artist, not the work. The basis for seeing the merit of the artist is how he is different from the artists of the bygone eras or from the other artists. There is something missed when one tries to criticize this way. It is pointed out that if we would only examine closely, the worth of the text is not mainly because of the individuality that is usually highlighted by critics, but the influences of the dead writers as well. Remember that these dead writers are the ones that represent the tradition. As we go on reading, we discover the part that seemingly discourage tradition. That is, when one blindly follows the tradition, when one adheres to it just because it has already been established. One striking statement is that novelty is better than repetition. Thus, any great artist must not just follow the convention, for a new taste must be introduced. Following the tradition is mere repetition. The text likewise discussed historical sense, which is captured by the phrase pastness of the past and presence of the past. A poet, therefore, must put together the past, which is the tradition, and the present, which is the new ingredient or technique or style added to the work. There must be conformity between the old and the new. The historical sense is what makes a writer traditional, and this carries timelessness or temporality or a combination of these two. No poet, no artist has his complete meaning alone. That's impossible, for the poet of this generation is made up of the accumulated knowledge earned through constant exposure to literary works produced even before his time, even before his generation. While exposing himself to the works, it must have been in his schema that these works were produced following the established tradition in the past. That is what is referred to as the established order. The tradition had already been in its tradition before the birthing of another literary production. Therefore, whatever newness that is introduced in the new text is expected to have been a conglomeration, a combination of the old and the new. To gauge, then, for criticism must consider both the old and the new. At this point, it somehow emphasizes not just conformity with the old, neither does it encourage putting much value to the new. The writer is only trying to tell us that artistry or creativity may be lost if one does not introduce something new. This newness, however, does not suggest that the old is dated and is of less value, for art does not improve. To improve means to make something better. This is not the case in terms of artistic production. Art never improves since the artistry that is inherent in the work is the representative voice of the artist's time or generation. The work of the previous generation carries with it the mark of the literary tradition of the time. Similarly, the works produced in this generation stamp the identity of the present literary tradition. No improvement then, just the difference in the material that covers the choice of rhetorical devices. The dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. If we follow the premise, then the new generation of writers were influenced by the previous generation of writers. Then Homer, as a writer, is a writer of the distant past, so much far that his knowledge is not so much or incomparable with the writers of the 21st century, supposedly. This is because the writers of the present century have been exposed and have been influenced by these generations of writers, each following a certain tradition. What follows is the continual self sacrifice of the writer, where the concept of depersonalization is introduced. The illustration of how it is to depersonalize is found in the second part. So, this is the second part on poetic practices required by tradition. Depersonalization is explained in the context of relationship between the poem and its author. This was achieved through an analogy and the introduction of the concept of being a catalyst. To be a catalyst is no other than just to be a medium, a conduit, as physics people would use it or would say it. This was further explained by pointing out the emotion that is embedded in the text. In our previous discussion, we then cited that the emotional value is the most contagious of all. It is inherent in the writer, it is transferred in the work, and then transferred to the reader. Eliot does not embrace this idea. For him, the emotion in poetry is detached from the emotion of the writer. The personality of the writer is detached from the emotional aspect of the text, thus, depersonalization. The emotion is just suggested by objects, images, and other linguistic signals that are found in the poem itself. The poet only serves as the medium to write in print these literary elements and make all these work together to suggest certain emotion. It was also pointed out that poets do not use new emotions. Indeed, which emotions are new? There is none. These are basic emotions given life by the poet in the work. Poetry, therefore, is not a work of art where writers dump his or her emotion as he or she turns it loose. Neither is it the expression of the writer's emotion to project part of his personality, to flesh out the emotion from the writer and transfer it to the work is not how it works. Instead, it is an escape from emotion and from personality. It is a cognitive process of dealing with emotion, a product of concentration. To illustrate this, the author borrowed lines from Dante's Inferno, which is taken from Canto 15, and it reads, "Remember my treasure, in which I shall live on. Ask no more." He turned then, and he seemed across that plain like one of those who run for the green cloth at Verona, and of those, more like the one who wins than those who lose. In these lines, we see a persona who admires the addressee. Where is it hinted? It is when the he was likened to a winner in the race. This is alluded through the use of the phrase green cloth. It has been a practice that on the first Sunday of Lent, all the young men of Verona race for the prize of green cloth. The he was described to have run for the green cloth and appeared to be more like the winner than the loser. That was his stance when Dante looked at him as he turned. Such was the admiration which was only suggested by the event. So, to conclude, a poet must surrender himself wholly to the work by living in the present moment of the past and by being conscious of what is already living. Let's not forget that he believes in the existence of great works, literary works that are considered masterpieces, or those that represent the tradition which set the ideal at a certain period of time. However, any poet, despite recognizing this tradition built in the past, must be able to express the characteristic sensibility of his or her age. Thank you for listening.